Hello, my name is Robert Harrison, and I will be summarizing Chapter 3 of Murray Sidman's book, Coercion and Its Fallout. This chapter is entitled Ivory Laboratory or Glass House. So, Sidman starts off this chapter kind of talking about how we as humans are in a de facto state of emergency. He explained, this is based on all of the examples that he's provided in the introduction and the first two chapters about how just coercion saturates our lives and society. So, based on that, we're in a de facto state of emergency. And he explains that some of our most serious problems actually come from the inability to manage or predict human behavior. He gives examples in the workplace of how we attempt to control or, excuse me, manage others' behaviors. Um, he talks about workers trying to get higher wages, management trying to increase productivity. He gives examples of uh, coercion, such as fines and imprisonment, that are used to stop behaviors like pollution and things with corporations and industries. Then Sidman goes on to talk about ourselves and how we also try to analyze and manage our own behaviors personally. He gives examples of how we use alarm clocks, academic planners, and things like that when we engage in trying to manage our own behaviors, like through maybe stop smoking or losing weight or exercise programs and things of that nature. So this leads me to my first quote that I wanted to talk about. Sidman says that behavior analysis does not advocate, but it simply investigates behavioral control. So this is a theme throughout the book. I kind of wanted to reiterate that. So again, we don't advocate it. We don't, you know, we're not proponents of it. We're simply here to analyze it and learn about it. Um, so he gives examples of how behavioral control exists already in society in like formal education and parenting. He explains how laws are basically just written contingencies. And then again, some of those examples of how we use behavioral control on ourselves. Sidman explains how this leads to some problems in humanity, or I should say, the failure to manage these behaviors efficiently leads to problems with humanity. He gives examples of how technology and pollution can cause issues. He explained the nuclear disaster and basically how that was, probably the epitome of one of these failures to manage others' behaviors or our own behaviors. So then I really like what he said about the nuclear disaster. He's kind of talking again, doom and gloom about these problems to humanity and how we're getting closer to such problems, such as that nuclear disaster, because most of the people who were alive during that time are now gone, and so there are fewer people alive whose behavior was influenced by such a disaster. So we're more concerned, and that presumed remoteness of that consequence is less concerning to us than financial or economic expense and inconveniences and things that might put off the next nuclear disaster. So he explains how we as behavior analysts, will need to tackle that problem, and I thought that was very interesting. So the next subheading in this chapter is entitled "What does it mean to do an experiment?" And in this chapter, Sidman basically discusses experimental conditions. When he starts off, he explains how an experiment is different from just a tryout. He talks about controls, and he gives examples of data techniques and measurement techniques of how they need to be step by step. They need to be clear and concise. And he also talks about how they must be available for public evaluation so that they're available for informed criticism and as well as repetition and things like that. He talks about other factors involved in an experiment, possible variables like lighting conditions, the season of the year, or any other information that might be relevant to the experiment or the target behavior or the question. So he talks about the benefits of a lab, of the lab setting, experiments in the lab, And he explains how in the lab setting, we keep all changes in the experimental condition relevant to the question. We can alter the environment and return it back to its original state. So effectively, we can turn a subject's actions on and off, in that setting. So by applying or removing a condition. So it zeroes in on the basics and it removes the irrelevancies that the real world, might have, and any confounds that might be present. So obviously, this leads to a great deal of criticisms. Many people explain, or excuse me, argue that these findings in the lab can't be generalized, that they're oversimplified. Which brings me to the next quote I wanted to use. This is kind of the meaning of the chapter. Sidman states that the ivory tower is not as isolated from the rest of the world as many would have us believe. He goes on to give examples about how test pilots they had to test their aircrafts in a laboratory setting before applying it in the real world. Similarly, genetics and cellular pathology all had to start in a laboratory setting. Now they are making leaps and bounds in the real world in applied settings. And Sidman basically argues that there's no reason why behavioral science can't follow the same path, which was really cool to me. The final part of this chapter has a subtitle of From Mouse to Mankind. And in this, basically, Sidman is explaining the generalizability of findings in the lab. And he starts off by talking about face validity, where this is a situation where people only observe like the exact or form of behavior of interest that they're looking for. That's a direct approach, and it kind of limits the understanding of behavior in general. He explains how it creates mini sciences, and I love the example he gave about how psychology has experts on everything from chess to sex. So that was kind of funny. But anyways, and that can obviously be problematic because then if you encounter a new problem, you're not able to generalize in order to solve that problem. So Sidman then goes on to propose, that we do the opposite. We pick an arbitrary behavior so that we can look at that with the absence of constraints, and then we might be able to generalize some of the findings and extend the relevance of the science. So he gives an example of a mouse experiment, and he talks about the details of the controls and things of that nature. But again, basically, he just talks about how we can have a mouse do an arbitrary behavior, the target behavior of pushing a button, which is not at all mouse-like or innate or anything. And it presses it relatively slow, and then if we feed it or provide a reinforcement every time it presses a button, then that behavior increases significantly. Okay, so then we're thinking, maybe this has changed his behavior. So we take the food away and the behavior goes back down, and then we repeat it, and every time we re-implement the treatment, the pushing button behavior goes higher, and so now we kind of have a causal relation, we think. So he explains how we found causal relations with experiments like that, and then not only mice, but then in other animals, monkeys, pigeons, things of that nature. So from there, Sidman explains that we now can take these causal relations and explain general, and we can infer a general principle that contingencies or consequences definitely impact behavior. He also gave examples of how not only would they push a button, but they could do arbitrary behavior such as pulling chains and things like that. So we're able to develop these general principles, and then we try to apply them to humans. And in the end of the chapter, he talks about applying these concepts to institutionalized humans, and we see similar results. So we're able to, again, kind of make that connection and see that consequences do have an impact on behavior. He makes the distinction that consequences are not punishment. And when he did that, and I made this slide, it actually, for when I put the word consequences up there, it wanted to give me a picture of handcuffs. So that is just how much coercion has saturated society. It saw the word on PowerPoint consequences, and it wanted to give me a picture of handcuffs. Even when I'm trying to explain how consequences are simply outcomes, they're not punishment, they're not negative. And that just is a good example of the pervasiveness in our society. So, finally, when Sidman is talking about how this can be used with humans, these general principles, he gives a good little example of how parenting can kind of go wrong. And I've seen this time and time again. So I wanted to ask you guys this question to end. If you're working with a family who seems to have been reinforcing troublesome behavior, and now it has escalated to problem behaviors in many areas, what are some ways to re-educate the parents, as Sidman suggests? So, again, when he was talking about how this can be generalized to humans, he was talking. He gave an example about problem behaviors and parents kind of creating it. I wasn't able to really explain that in depth, but I really got interested in the part that he said about re-educating some parents. I find that in my role as very difficult to do, so I wanted to open this up for discussion. Thank you, guys.